great to see such a good crowd here. I am sure many of you know George very well, but I will still have to announce him because that's part of my position here. So George has been at Hope College since 1969, and that is significant in a way because he was a missionary kid and he traveled many places, with his parents, and then sent away to schools, and then went to schools in the US. And when he came to Hope, he found a home, and that is part of the title, and he will talk about this. George is also a musician, and he and his wife have really brought a lot of joy to not just to this community, but also in the many communities around Holland. He's a missionary kid. His parents went to Tibet at a time that it was just a wild place still, and not very well known. And it was a great hardship for them, and also for George, of course, although he was raised with a lot of tender care by his parents, but he also needed to be sent away for education, and that was pretty tough for a young kid. But he will talk about this at great length. We have his book here also, so it's for purchase. In the old days, that would be a no-no, to sell things on Sunday, but we just break all the rules here. Yes. So. Oh. Yes. That's good. It all goes to the Van Raalte Institute. And that brings me actually to another topic. We have the Van Raalte Press, and we have already published quite a few. I say we because I'm part of that. We've published a lot of books already, but in the last 3 or 4 years, we have a kind of a subsidiary of the Van Raalte Press, and these are books pertaining to the missionary experience. And what is different or from other missionary memoirs is that these have generally been written by the offspring of missionaries. So there is a perhaps more objectivity, but also very frequently they are more contextual than the previous ones. So, George, are you ready?
Yeah, the Missionary Memoir series is about 4 books in it now. And Don Leidens is the editor for that. And I want to thank Don Leidens publicly for going through my book very carefully. He rewrote sections, and he just was a fantastic editor. So I want to thank him. Paul Husingfeld is here, and his book, Elephant Baseball, if you haven't read it, is a fascinating book. And Paul's right over here if you want to talk to him about his book and his experiences. He went to Kodaikanal in India. For high school, which is different than me. Our mission made the decision that after you turn 10 years old, you would then go back to your passport country and be raised in your passport country in a mission home. So it's a different setup than Paul, who went to Kodaikanal through high school. That's a big difference between the China Inland Mission and the Reformed Church missions. So I want to be sure I thank Don and Paul. And I'm a visual, I don't know about you, but I'm a visual learner. I learn better through seeing and doing than I do through reading and listening. So I picked up about 50, there's 120 photographs in the book. So I've selected some photographs, and I'm going to center my conversation around those photographs. And when I see the photograph, they say a picture is worth 1,000 words. And I think Viking has it better to see something once than hear about it 1,000 times. I don't know if you agree or disagree with that, but I do learn better through doing and through seeing. So anyway, and this is like Nella said, this is the final part of this book. I might just read the very closing end of the book because it's so true for me. The last paragraph in the book. Life is what you make of it. My father survived a turbulent youth, and he did survive a very turbulent youth and thrived in faraway Tibet. My mother, on her way to education leadership in the Twin Cities, found that she was called in a very different direction. I do not regret that what their choices produced for me. It has been a rich one, and then Don added this, filled with adventure and challenges beyond most folks' wildest imaginations. I don't know if that's true or not, but in the end, I'm grateful that I found Robbie and that we both found Hope College in Holland, Michigan, a place to call home. And Hope has been, people to know me know that Hope College is, I live and die Hope College, and it's my school, and I couldn't imagine living any place other than Holland, Michigan. I brought along a few visual aids in the book. This is our hymnal that we used, 720 hymns from first grade through high school. For 12 years, we sang every single day from the hymnal. So I learned hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of hymns and can still sing most of them today. And I might just pass this around. It's kind of an interesting hymnal for some of you. It's might look at that one. And I think most missionary kids, my Aunt Helen, in 1946, we went to China right after the Second World War. The armistice with Japan was signed on September 2, 1945. And in November of 45, my family was on the way back to China. And my Aunt Helen gave me this stamp book, and it has 150 different countries, 2,500 stamps. And I think missionary kids, Paul, did you have a stamp collection? I think most missionary kids, you get letters from your parents, and they're missionaries. Most of the missionaries are from England, but they're from Canada, some of the European countries, Australia, New Zealand. So you trade stamps. That was just a big thing. And so stamp collecting was big. And I do think that really helped missionary kids have a sense of geography just by the nature of where we were born and raised. And the stamp collection really helps you sort of see where all the countries are, and you learn a little bit more about geography than many American young people do. Just some of those handouts real quickly. I thought about maybe playing Tigers in the Grass. It's just a poignant hymn by Richard Lane, but do me a favor, when you go home, the next time you're on your computer, just type in Tigers in the Grass, Richard Lane, and listen to this. It's just Paul, I think, will agree. It's a haunting melody, and you can read the words there, and you can kind of imagine what it says. The very last line, Chief who kept us safe, Chief who kept us warm. Chief was the name of the schools that I went to. It started in Chifu, China, but regardless of where it was, it maintained the name Chifu. It was a British system of education more than it was just a location. So we kept calling it Chifu regardless of where the school was. I'd recommend that. I thank David Myers. I think David Myers had a very insightful comment here where he said, Kraft's memoir brings Chinese mission history to life and prompts us to assess our lives by asking, what is our highest priority? Our children, our comfort, or our calling? And I'd ask you that question. Talk about that. What's more important, your career, your children, or the creature comforts that you experience here in Holland, Michigan? Is a good question. And certainly for my parents had to make a decision in that regard. And I think my mother, my father saw that one a little bit differently. And I'll mention that as I go along. And then just some books, if you're interested in anything that I read about. Certainly, if you're interested in the China Inland Mission, the first book to read is Hudson Taylor's Spiritual Secret. It's written by his grandson, and it just really shares a very interesting life. And I won't mention some of those others there, but those are books that you can read. Okay, let's go to the first slide. If we're ready back there. It's a little map. It's a map of Mark Cook did all the maps in the book, and they're just exceptionally well done. This is just a quick update on China. It doesn't quite show it quite as well, but the map that I had shows there's a map of China. You can see this is Shantung province right here. China, the mission school is right there across the Yellow Sea, right across from Korea. Strange place for the mission school because it's a China inland mission. Most of the missions had been the coast, and the mission decided most of the missionaries were inland. So it was a full month from there to where my parents were missionaries up on the border of Tibet. 1 month trip one way. So you didn't see your folks very often. Then of course you see Taiwan and some of the various provinces. Japan, in the map of the book, it shows the colored where Japan, what Japan controlled. And they did take over Burma, which is now Myanmar. And I'll talk about the flying over the hump, which our family had to do in the middle of the Second World War. So that's just a quick map there on the geographic situation during the Second World War. The next two slides are interesting ones. This is just a closer look at here you see the Shantung compound, Chifu, Guling, one of the most beautiful places in the world, where I went to school for 3 years. And then of course, there's Hong Kong and Shanghai. Peking, or it's now called Beijing, up there. That's just a map there. Okay, the next slide. This is an interesting one. This is on the deck of the Hyunmaru, a Japanese ship. My mother, Pearl Strode, Ruth Temple, Grace Liddell Cox, and Pearl Galloway. Anybody know who that? Recognize that lady? That's John Cox's mother. You know, John, his mother, my mother, 4 single women that went to China. They left in November of 1934. And so there were 4. Then the next picture shows, these are the one different lady there, but there's John Cox's mom. There's my mother dressed in their Chinese garb when they were in language school. I want to make a comment here real quickly. You know, in the 1930s, if you didn't have a high school education, you were a woman, you could be a telephone operator or a secretary. If you had a college education, you could be a nurse or a teacher. And my mother had been a teacher for 3 or 4 years. She was 7.5 years older than my father. And she's an excellent teacher, excellent educator. But she heard God's call to be missionary, and she up and left for China. I was going to mention, all these ladies have a college education. I think for a single woman, there was even a higher calling than being a teacher or a nurse. And back in those days, that was to be a foreign missionary. That was kind of the pinnacle. You know, if you'd be willing to really sort of almost put your family aside and dedicate your life to the call of the gospel. And I remember the old hymn. Remember the old hymn, "So send I you." So send I you to suffer unrewarded, to serve unpaid, unloved, unsought, to bear rebuke, to suffer scorn and scoffing. So send I you to bear my cross alone, as a Father has sent me. My dad thought that hymn was just a crock of baloney. You know, the life of a missionary for him was the most dynamic, exciting, powerful, exhilarating life that one could possibly have. Elements of truth possibly from my mother in that poem, but certainly not from my father. And all these ladies got married. The majority of missionaries were single women that went to China, and educated single women. The women usually had a college education. My father did not. So it was kind of interesting that was the situation in the Channel Mission. Okay, the next slide. There's this picture of my mother in language school. For the first 6 months, she went to language school that separated the men and the women for language school. And then after language school, you go to the next picture. They would assign you then after 6 months to a seasoned missionary. This is Ruth Muller in the middle, and that's Pearl Galloway and Pearl Strode. They went to be with her for about a year while they continued to learn Chinese, and had a Chinese tutor, and would learn the Chinese customs and culture. And then next slide. There's my father. My father left in August of 45. So about 9 months after my mother, my father went to China. They were both raised in Minneapolis, Minnesota. They knew each other, but my mother was 7.5 years older than my father, so there wasn't really a romantic relationship. But they did know each other in Minneapolis. That's my dad. My dad was 6'4", 220 pounds, and you know, and not an ounce of body fat on the man. But you know what his best skill was? Diving. You don't have many 220 6'4" divers. He could do the 1.5 pike, the 1.5 jackknife, the reverse dive, all the Olympic dives, and could do them well. Just an extremely gifted athlete. I wish I had his size and his strength and his coordination. Okay, the next slide then is my dad. There he is in his European garb with a stack of language books. My father ended up he learned fluent Sichuanese, Mandarin, and Tibetan. In fact, there's no question that he spoke Tibetan better than any Westerner. He wrote, in fact, when he was 80 years old, 40 years after he had left Tibet, he still spoke Tibetan fluently enough that he wrote the Tibetan primer that is now used by all Westerners who go to Tibet. In fact, when we went back to Tibet with my brother in 2012, we talked to people. They said, sure, we all just used your dad's textbook to learn the common dialect of Tibetan. So even though he didn't have a college education, the man was obviously brilliant. Okay, the next slide. They meet in January of 38. There's my mother and my father. And that's about the time that my dad then proposed to my mom. And then the next picture, I think, is their wedding. Yep, there they are at their wedding in September 14, 1938. I was born in Chengdu, China in November 14th, 1939. It was right in the middle of the Second World War. In China, they called it the Sino-Japanese War. Chinese-Japanese War is what they call it, of course. So I was born right in the middle of it in Chengdu. Chengdu is in the western side of Sichuan province. We're right adjacent to Tibet. And then my parents then went from there up to Tibet. So there's a picture. The next picture, I think, is of the wedding party. Where do you get these wedding dresses? They're passed down. One woman would use it, be married, and the wedding dress would then be passed on to somebody else. So they would use the wedding dress. And then the next picture. That's mom and dad. This is just before I was born in, like I said, in November of 1939. And they said they really couldn't go up what's called the China Tea Trail that I'll show you in a minute, until I was a little bit older. When I was 6 months old, they decided they could take a chance on the China Tea Trail. And they went up to Tibet. So the next slide might show that. Well, there's my dad weighing me. I don't know if you got weighed that way, but dad making sure that I'm growing well. Okay. And the next slide. This I'd like, this reminds me, I've offered to teach a course for HASP this summer, if you're interested. And it's going to be 2 sessions, an hour and a half each session. In the first session, I'm going to look at more of the cultural and the historical context of my childhood. And then second session, look at more of the personal impact on a missionary kid and our missionary families. It'd be more the personal. So if you want a little more in depth, you can check for that on the HASP schedule for the summer. This is the China Tea Trail, and it's a very hazardous trail. The Silk Road, or the Silk Roads, obviously from northwest China, coming out of Xi'an, are well known. But I tell you what, the China Tea Trail, the Tibetans, all they had to really drink was kind of a barley beer and yak milk, goat milk, and they needed a warm beverage. And so Yunnan and Sichuan provinces were the first places that cultivated tea in the history of the world. And so this China Tea Trail, the Tibetans wanted this nice Chinese green tea, different green teas. So these are porters that would actually carry. That's about 200 pounds of tea on that man's back. They'd go up the China Tea Trail. And you said, why didn't they have the Chinese, the Nanchang, a Tibetan horse, do that? There were parts of the trail that were so steep, you had to go up on your hands and your feet. So really a horse with a load couldn't do it. So it was a man, and I've read about that. Basically, the way they would go as they climbed from 1,000 to 2,000, 3, 4, 5, up to 10,000, 11,000, 12,000 feet. They would just literally go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, rest, 2, 3, 4. And they would do that, take about 14 days to get from Sichuan, western Sichuan province, to Kongding. My parents were missionaries in Kongding, which was right on the border of Tibet. And that started in about the 5th century AD. And let's see what the next picture is. The only way to get from China to Tibet, essentially really from Sichuan, was over this rope bridge. This is the Cadillac of bridges. This is the finest bridge. And so you really had to go to this location over the Dadu River in Luding to get to China. And so my mother was always a little fearful and frightened of some of these bridges. And remember, my brother and I would sort of kid my mother sometimes about, oh, come on, Mom, just get across this bridge. But sometimes some of the bridges were just, like 2 ropes to walk on and two ropes to hold on to. And my mother would actually get on my dad's back. My dad would actually literally carry her over some of these bridges. The next picture I show is what this is during the Second World War. One of the interesting chapters in the book, I don't know if you agree, is a chapter on the harrowing trip that my parents decided to take in the middle of the Second World War. My dad decides it's time for us to get home. They've been in China for about 10 years. It's time to get back to the States. But of course, the war was raging. And this is a Douglas C-47 military airplane going over what was called the hump. How many of you heard of the hump flight? The Burma Road, the Japanese took over the Burma Road. That was their normal route from Burma, now Myanmar, to southwest China. When the Japanese took over that, we had to do this airlift essentially to get any materials of any kind from the Allied troops to China, had to take these Douglas C-47s. And I might just mention, I said I thought it was a dangerous trip. Here's a little quote. If you do read the book, I recommend you read the end notes. A lot of the interesting stuff is in the end notes, but here's one. The Burma Road was constructed in 1938 as a principal supply route from Burma, now Myanmar, to southwest China. When Japan captured that road, U.S. airmen were forced to fly hundreds of missions over the hump. The hump flight over the Himalayan mountains was a pioneering aviation operation that had just about everything working against it. Foreboding mountains, terrible weather much of the time, Japanese fighter planes, crude navigational instruments, night flights, unproven aircraft, and inexperienced flight and maintenance crews. Most commanders consider the flight over the hump more dangerous than a bombing mission over Europe. More than 1,300 pilots and crew members were lost, and over 500 planes crashed. And I put down, fortunately, we made it. It was a little, I don't know, my dad he decided it was time. My dad was the one that made the decisions in the family, and so we took this trip. The next picture, I think, shows you just, this is a little bit out of order. This is the new bridge over the Dadu River. You see those foreboding mountains on the right side of the picture there. When we would go out, we'd have to go up, over, and around and down the other side of those mountains. And just that little trip alone was 4 days. The Chinese now have a divided highway that goes 10 miles underground. So now what took 4 days, now you're doing about 15 minutes. So the infrastructure in China, as far as roads and airports, it's just unbelievable. I mean, you get on their highways, it's just incredible. Anyway, that was the communists have built that bridge now. The next picture. Oh, that's a nice picture of my father. My dad and mom went to China to evangelize. They were evangelists. My dad wasn't a medical doctor. He went there to be an evangelist, to tell the heathen about the good news of Jesus Christ. And that's why he went. And this is the little chapel there in Kongding, where my dad was preaching to the church. It must have been a little bit cold. My dad has a pretty warm jacket. Talking about creature comforts, my parents certainly decided to sacrifice creature comforts when they went to be missionaries in China. And the next picture here, this is my dad in one of the caravan stops. And my dad, what those are stacked up in the back there are those tea bags, those tea bags that those coolies were carrying, the porters were carrying. And one of the contests that Tibetans like to have, the traders, would be who could stack the most tea bags with a pitchfork up on top of each other, on the side of these caravan stops. And the strongest Tibetans could only do 18. My dad could regularly toss 21. And so news of this foreigner with this incredible strength sort of attracted people. Well, I want to come and listen to this guy. What's he got to say? So it did provide my father with an opportunity to share the gospel. And this is where he did a lot of his work, just kind of going to these stops and talking with muleteers or different people as they were going about their trade. And then the next picture, this is just, maybe go to the next one after this. This is the middle of the Second World War, this six-month trip that we took. So we start there in China, in this insert map, and you can see the town. town of Kunming right here. And this is the over the hump, flying over the hump. I often thought it just went straight across. No, we actually would go over this way and refuel in Duzhong and then come on down to Calcutta. And then from Calcutta, you go to the next slide now. From Calcutta, we went across. Well, anyway, we went across the Indian Ocean, and down in the Atlantic, South Atlantic. We had to be in blackout the whole time because Japanese submarines. We got to the Cape of Good Hope in South Africa. We saw a lot of sunken vessels. Then we'd come around the Cape of Good Hope. Then we went on the Atlantic all the way to Valparaiso, Argentina. I'm sorry, not Valparaiso in Chile, Buenos Aires in Argentina, then over the Andes Mountain down to Santiago in Chile, then hugged the coast of the east coast of South America through the Panama Canal to Havana, then from Havana to New Orleans, and New Orleans on a train to Minneapolis. And the picture you just saw there, this is our family in the Minneapolis Tribune when we arrived at the train station. So the Minneapolis Tribune was there, and there's an article I have in the book that they talked about my parents and what they experienced. So that, of course, is me. That's my younger brother, who's 21 months younger than I am, and my mom and my dad. Okay, the next slide. The founder of the mission, Hudson Taylor, recommended unbelievable story. How many of you? Some of you done any reading on Hudson Taylor, the founder of the mission? In 1865, he was on Brighton Beach in England, and he felt this call of God to send Christian missionaries to the inland of China. The Reformed Church and other denominations had quite a mission stations along the coast, but they hadn't gone inland. And so the story is unbelievable. That was 65. By 1870, there was 22 missionaries went, and by 1885, there were 240 missionaries of the Channel Mission. And who was the principal fundraiser? Now, if you go to be a missionary, you got to raise your support yourself before you go. Hudson Taylor said, I'll bear the majority of the responsibility to raise the money. He had contacts in England. It was a British mission. And just an incredible story of how God provided the money for 240 missionaries. You know, he's the principal doing it all himself practically. Just an incredible story. Just a very interesting man. Okay, and then the next slide. This is up. This is the dad. This would be my dad with some of the Tibetans there. This is outside their mission compound. I got home once for Christmas. Like I said, it took about 3 weeks to get there, so 3 weeks to get back. So this is my brother was with my parents at the time. He hadn't gone to school yet. And so I spent 1 week with him. That's just a picture of me with some of my dad's Tibetan friends. And then the next one, next slide. There we are, Christmas. That's Christmas vacation of 46. That's the only Christmas I saw my folks. The other Christmases, 47, 48, 49, and 50, I wasn't able to get home. Then the next one. This is this Nanchang horse. This is the horse that the Chinese would trade that tea for. It's sometimes called the tea horse road. So the Tibetans would get their tea, and for about the amount of tea that porter had in his back, you could get one of these horses. And the Chinese really needed these horses in their fights against the warlords were coming down from Manchuria. Of course, you know, they built the Great Wall, but they needed that. So thousands and thousands of horses and millions and millions of tons of tea have traded hands back and forth since the 6th century. And this continued up through the Second World War until China built that motor road up to Kongding. And the next slide. This is just a picture. After the Second World War, I mentioned that the mission school had been in the Shandong province there. Right after, they decided to go back to Shanghai, but Shanghai had been bombed out in the war. It was kind of a desolate place. We went to school there for a year and a half, and then we got on this plane here, and we flew up to a place called Guling and Lushan Mountain. Maybe it's in the next slide. I'm not sure. Check the next slide. Yeah, this is up on Lushan Mountain. In 1992, Mount Lushan was designated a World Heritage Site. And it's one of the most beautiful places on earth. So we went from Shanghai, kind of a bombed out city, to one of the most beautiful places in the world. And this really is. It's Chiang Kai-shek had a summer home summer villa on Lushan Mountain. When the communists took over, Mao Zedong took the exact same villa that Chiang Kai-shek had and lived in it in Guling. And when we went back in 2012, you got the picture of Mao and Jiang right there in the front entrance as you walked into the villa, which I thought was kind of interesting. These are the buildings that we went to school in. This is McCarthy House and Bruce House, Conway House. Just a picture, an aerial view of where we went to school. Okay. Mark Cook probably spent 100 hours on this map. This is the most definitive map you're going to get of this beautiful place in China, from 1948 to 1950. And I think it shows. Oh, here it is. This is the villa of Chiang Kai-shek and Madame Jiang. Maybe some of you know Madame Jiang was a devout Christian woman. And so she visited our school on a few occasions. She died at 105 in New York City. And she accredited a long life to reading the Bible and praying for an hour every morning. So Jiang was married to a very devout Christian woman. Whether he became a Christian or not is, I don't know. Anyway, this is the school. Just a gorgeous place. I think some of the pictures you'll see here following show a little bit about take the next picture here. That's a little bit of a dangerous spot. I don't think I would, if I was the teacher here, I don't think I'd have my kids sitting on that particular peak, but resting with a view of the deep mist-covered valleys. And then the next one, that's just a view of the Lushan Mountain with the clouds around it. Okay, Lushan, yeah. And Zhujiang is the city below, looking down from what we call Lion's Leap, favorite place to go to called Lion's Leap, where we could look down into the valley below. And then the next slide, one of our favorite swimming holes. And it was interesting, 2012, we went back and I walked down to this swimming hole and I got kind of tired getting down there. I don't remember as a kid being particularly that tired going down there, but there were a lot. I might I think I have a little summary of Guling, just to quote it here. 170 peaks, 20 valleys, 16 mountain streams, 22 waterfalls, 3,000 varieties of plant life, 200 specimens of insects, 120 varieties of birds, and 22 types of animals. Every one of us had a butterfly net, and we'd go out and we'd catch the butterflies. Maybe you did this too, and make the board where you put the butterflies in it. I learned. That's how I learned. I'll be honest. I hate to admit this to you, but I don't ever remember being in a classroom. I remember chasing birds. I remember gathering insects, but sitting in a classroom, I don't remember it. And none of you think, really? You were 11 years old when you left, but I really don't. But I do remember learning, going out and doing things. And I do remember sports, of course, because you're doing something. I really enjoyed sports and singing. Interesting. Like I said, we sang every day. What do you think the last thing we did every night before we went to sleep? We sang. We sang from that Golden Bells. And so every night for 12 years, we sang from Golden Bells. So, I discovered then that my voice was better than some of the other kids around me. And also I could sing a little louder than some of the other kids around me. So I think you gravitate to what you do well when you're a kid. So I like to sing, so I continued singing. And really that's one of the things that attracted me to Roberta, was the fact that she was a musician and I knew we could sing and play and do programs. So that worked out well. In fact, just a quick story about program. When we flew over the hump, I was doing some research on a program we're doing called Hymns My Mother Taught Me, History of American Gospel Song. Maybe some of you have heard us do that program, but I discovered that American Army pilot, John Peterson, one of the better songwriters of the gospel songwriters of the 20th century, maybe the leading songwriter of the 20th century. He was one of those Army Air Corps pilots that flew back and forth over the hump every night, night after night after night. That's what he did, bring in supplies. And during these flights, as he was flying at night, he would write the poems. and both the words and the music. Maybe some of you remember, well, it took a miracle. My Father's omnipotent, and that you can't deny. A God of might and miracles is written in the sky. It took a miracle to put the stars in space. It took a miracle to hang the world in place. When you saved my soul, cleansed and made me whole. It took a miracle of love and grace. That was one of the many, many. And he wrote that hymn as he was going back and forth over the hump. But anyway, the wonderful swim places to swim. And I think the next one maybe shows another one. Oh, that's the mission school. That's the kids. I'm in a sport coat right there, and my brother is right here. And that's the missionary kids. We had about 95 kids, K through 1 through 12, that were in the school. And our teachers are mostly, I think all of them were from England. It was basically it was a British mission until Dwight L. Moody invited Hudson Taylor to come to the States. And that was around the turn of the century, 1900. And at that time, then 18 American citizens went with the Channel Mission. That was the first Americans to be a part of the mission process. We had mostly British teachers, and I definitely came back to the States with a heavy British accent. But that's the group. Our Stanley Houghton, our headmaster right here. Story there was I was about 8 years old, and all of a sudden we're reading in the dining hall. And we saw a very somber procession coming up the alley next to where we're reading, and he died of a heart attack on the tennis court at about 45 years of age. Fortunately, we had another man, Gordon Harmon, who made obvious sense for him to become the headmaster of the school, but that was quite a time. We all sang Psalm 46, God is our refuge and our strength. In trouble, a very present help. Therefore will not we fear, therefore will not we fear. Lord of hosts is with us. The God of Jacob is our refuge. And that was the same song. I'll get to that a little bit later. Next slide. This is how you get up to Goulet. There were no bicycles, no cars, no roads. You got to Goulet. My dad called these wagons. I think that's a Sichuanese name for a carrying chair. So the younger kids would be carried up in these carrying chairs to Goulet. And that's just a picture. I think when you turned about 10 or so, then you'd walk up. It was about a 12-mile trip. But when you were younger, you would be taken up in the wagons. The next one shows another. Oh, this is my brother and me pretending like we're learning how to dive. Since my dad was such a good diver, he was trying to teach us how to dive, I think. I don't know if I never was a very good diver, but anyway, we're sort of there. This was the pool that was in Goulet. There's just another picture of going up those 1,000 steps, they called it, to Goulet. Okay. This is the Gap pool. This is where my dad, the one time my dad was able to visit us in Goulet, he'd go to the top of this tower and wow everybody with his 1.5 tuck position pike gainers, just a tremendous athlete. But that was the pool where I learned to swim, and I enjoyed swimming. Okay. The wintertime, that was that typical winter. We had a big playing field, and we put this toboggan running down, and you come shooting down all the way. There was probably about a 400-foot drop down the mountains going through kids love to do that. We all did that. This is a toboggan sled there in the wintertime. And I spent one Christmas since my parents were 3 weeks away, I couldn't really get to see them that often. So I spent 1 week in Goulet, and I rather enjoyed that Christmas. There were about 15 or 20 of us kids that couldn't get home. Parents were too far away. And so we had just 15 of us. We had a great time doing the sledding and doing that kind of stuff. Okay, next slide. That's just me there pretending like I'm trying to learn archery with a couple of my friends. Okay. High jump, there's Stanley Houghton. That's another man who was quite well known if you read about him in the mission. Monitoring the high jumping competition. I taught biomechanics at Hope for 40 years. That's not the form I'd recommend to gain maximum height. But anyway, we had field days where we'd have this competition. Track and field is called athletics in England, so we had athletic days, and athletic days meant track and field. That's what it means in England. Okay, and then the next. This is a picture. the communists took over. The communists declared the People's Republic of China on October 1, 1949. Well, in the Christmas of 1950, for some reason or other, the mission decided they would allow my brother and me to try to get back up to Tibet. The communists had taken over China. It was kind of a foolhardy venture. I never understood why the mission approved it in the first place. But we had adults take us various parts of the way. We'd never met our sister, so we were kind of anxious to meet our sister. She was a trailer, 10 years younger than me. She'd been born up on the border of Tibet, and so we kind of wanted to see her. So we started working our way across China. We got to Chengdu, where I was born, and it was obvious it made no sense for us to try to get up into Tibet. Bandits were rampant. Banditry was a profession in Tibet, always has been. And one of the 6 professions, you could be a farmer, a priest, a bandit, or a trader trading in goods. So it was too dangerous. So we were in Chengdu for 6 months. Fortunately, there was a very well-educated man, Gordon Harmon, who hadn't been a teacher, but was very knowledgeable. We didn't have any textbooks, but he became our teacher for 6 months. Finally, my parents, this is a passport photo. They're able to, the communists let him come to. My dad was interrogated many days, many times by the communists. They wanted to find out if a lot of missionaries had collaborated with Chiang Kai-shek in the Second World War. And if you had, you were in trouble. If you could get some other missionary to sort of tell on you and admit that yes, you had been, you weren't getting out of China. So my dad was very careful with what he said. I meant to mention earlier for another, since you know this woman, did anybody know whose maiden name is Petterkin? Somebody that most of you know, Carol Myers. And the reason I'm mentioning her dad, Major Petterkin, during the Second World War, in that first map I was showing you, he was in charge of the Dixie Brigade. And the Dixie Brigade was a group of about 50 American soldiers that were in the southwest part of China, was nationalist China. The northwest was controlled by Mao Zedong, and the Japanese are sweeping across from the east. So they operated in free China or nationalist China, and they were kind of probing and determining where the Japanese were, where Mao was, and giving feedback to our military on that. And he wrote a diary that Carol published on her father's experiences as the Dixie Brigade. So if you see Carol, she gave me a copy. She had a copy left in her basement, but it's basically her dad's chronological line of her father's experiences. Okay, so there's my parents coming out of Tibet. Next slide. There's our family home on furlough. When we came home to the States in '51. And my parents had to decide what they were going to do next. China had closed, as you know, to the gospel because of communism. They made a decision to go back to Taiwan. And this is where I might just mention the sabbaticals were granted we call them sabbaticals or furloughs, were granted every 7 years for missionaries. Now, when the mission had to leave China and go to the Pacific Rim countries, Thailand, Philippines, Japan, Cambodia, Vietnam, around the Pacific Rim, they made the decision that since the children, when they're 10 years old, came to live in their passport country, that 7 years was too long for parents and children to be separated. So they reduced the time of separation to 4 years. So I saw my parents then when they came back. I saw them when I was in 7th grade, 11th grade for about 6 months. Then when I was a junior in college, and then 2 years after I graduated from college, and then 6 years after was sort of the schedule. What impact did that have on the family? I mean, I'd obviously, if I had more time, I'd go into it in more detail, but I might just read a couple things. And I think of my mother more than my father. My father's career came first. He was hell-bent, I can use the word, to save these people of Tibet and China. But for mother, it was a struggle. And if I can find the passage here very quickly. This is where it goes here. Whereas Dad seemed to reconcile leaving me in Shanghai. This was when I was 6 years old. It was more difficult for Mom. She consoled herself with the promises of Scripture. Mom said that her heartache with this brief Mom shared her heartache with this brief narrative prayer letter she wrote about a night on the long trip to Kongding after leaving me in Shanghai. 4-year-old Dick had awoken during the night and he said, "I'm tired, I'm dirty, I'm hungry, I'm thirsty, and I want to be back in Minneapolis." She soothed him, but then went on to say, we left our precious George in Shanghai, an American boy in China, living with a German family that didn't speak a word of English. So I lived with them for 6 months. My dad was so anxious to get back to China that the mission school hadn't even returned from India yet. So I lived with this German family in Shanghai because Dad had to get to Tibet now. He couldn't wait 6 months. He had to get there now. So they left me with this German family. And that was not a happy time for me. I'll agree with that. But she soothes them by saying, we left our precious George in Shanghai. And then she went on to say, there's no man that left children for my sake and the Gospels, but he shall receive 100-fold. We're claiming children from among the Tibetans. Pray with us. The sacrifice of leaving her son behind was well worth claiming in Tibetan lives from eternal damnation. But it was tough for my mother. In fact, I think I might read when they went back to Taiwan and they had to leave my sister when she was 10 years old in Wheaton, Illinois. This was my mother's take on that one. You can find it here. Oh, here it is. There's August was an important, this is 16 years later. August was an important month for the Krafts. On August 12th, Dick turned 21 years old. On August 17th, George graduated from Wheaton College and was commissioned a second lieutenant in the United States Army. On August 20th, our Lois entered her teens, and on August 25, George and Robbie Conard, a Wheaton classmate of George, were married in Denver, Colorado. According to all reports, it was a beautiful wedding, with Dick as the best man and Lois as one of the bridesmaids. How we would love to have been in the United States for the month of August. But then his mother always did. This is of him, not what I wish to do and where I wish to go. For who am I that I should choose my way? The Lord will choose for me. There's better far I know. So let him bid me go or stay. You decide for yourself. That's how my mother attempted so many times to reconcile all the separations with passages of scripture. You can find passages, you're leaving your children for the sake of the gospel. There's passages like that in the King James. Yeah, and she would regularly use those. My father, it was interesting. My father, as you can tell, was a driven, interesting personality. I see some of myself in him, but let's see if I can find a quote here from my father. Yes, here's my father. He said here, a letter he wrote home, he said, most American missions provide schooling for children on the field right through high school, as was the case with Paul. It would be a tragic and a shattering thing for me personally. My dad was an acting superintendent of the mission at this time. If we should lose some of the able young couples now with us through any administrative failure, George and Dick seem to sail through these critical years with aplomb. But we're concerned about our younger daughter, Lois. They should have been concerned. It was just her experience in the mission home was beyond my even beginning to share the story. But anyway, here's my brother's response. On a personal level, I object to my father's words, George and Dick sailed through these critical years with aplomb, as all of us can testify that our dad was not a very insightful person when it came to either self-analysis or the emotions of others. His letter has zero insight into the strength it took a child and an adolescent to be torn apart from his parents and never really know what it meant to grow up in a secure home. His words are based on a lifetime of letters each week, assuring our parents that we are fine. The name of a book most missionary kids never called Letters Never Written. Many letters throughout childhood, in fact, most of our letters were monitored. They would open them up to me. They wanted to make sure that we didn't say anything negative in the letters because that could affect our parents' ministry. And the most important thing, of course, was that they be effective in ministry, not get an honest letter from their children. Because if we tell them we were sad and wanted to see them badly, then maybe they would not serve the Lord on the mission field, which is what they were called to do. So you can see my brother uses the word abandon twice in the book. I never used the word abandon in regards to my parents, but my brother did. And it's back to our family. My sister, one thing that, this is a little story. God had told, my mother said God told her that all of her 3 kids would graduate from Wheaton College. That was really important for my mother. And my brother and I did, but my sister bolted the faith, bolted Wheaton, went to the University of Illinois. And that, that was tough for my mother. God had told her something, and her youngest daughter and my sisters hasn't darkened the door of a church since she left the mission home. So it's there are some, the pluses and minuses of the mission in those days. Anyway, so I grew up in Wheaton, Illinois. Next slide. Well, they went to Taiwan. They were missionaries in Kaohsiung. My sister, they set up these little small grade schools, if you want to call them that. And my sister went to Chiai there for school for a while, and also in Tainan. And she'd come home on weekends. And she's, like I say, she's 10 years younger. And she says that when she went home, that most every night she heard mother crying herself to sleep. So it was, yeah, and that's what she had said about that. So then they went to Taiwan, or missionaries there for almost 20 years. And the next slide, this is the mission home in Wheaton, Illinois. I think for me, saving grace was, I think I was kind of an extrovert. I was an organizer. I loved to organize things, and I loved to play games and do pranks and that kind of stuff. And I think that helped me as a child. I was able to sort of overcome some of the struggles by just being an extrovert and enjoying relationships with others. And that's the group of us with our house parents at the top. One of the unfortunate things about the China mission, I think other missions do, in fact, I know other missions, a lot of times they wouldn't put the most able people in charge of 20 missionary kids in these hostels. They would pick somebody who maybe wasn't that effective as a missionary on the foreign mission field. And anybody can raise 20 kids. We all know that. So you would just find somebody who maybe wasn't effective, and then they would then be our legal guardians and raise us. And it wasn't an ideal situation. I got along fine. I played sports. Fortunately, our guardian loved sports, and I did fine. But there were a lot of missionary kids that fell between the cracks. So story wasn't quite like mine. So that's the group of us there in 58. Okay, next slide. Oh, I'll go quickly through these. This is when I was at Wheaton College. I thought I was going to be I was intending to be Army, going to the Army full time for my career. I took Wheaton's different than Hope. Wheaton in 1952 started an ROTC program. All men at Wheaton when I was there were given a dress greens by Uncle Sam and had to take ROTC for the first 2 years, freshman and sophomore year. And then if you wanted to go to the Army, you could elect your junior and senior year. And since I decided I want to make it a career, I obviously took it seriously. I took 3 things seriously, Wheaton. One, the first one was trying to get Robbie to pay attention to me. She absolutely didn't know I existed. I mean, I said, come on now. But I was like the tortoise in the hare. All the upper class boys were dating her. And then finally, by her senior year, she realized, hey, maybe I needed to take. But anyway, I took, that's Robbie in the picture there, along with me getting that award. Dr. Edmund was the president of Wheaton at the time. The next picture. Well, you can see by my senior year, I'd gotten her to pay some attention to me. You all have pictures like that. That's just a picture taken in our senior year. Okay. Here's a picture of my father. He's in his 80s. At this time, he's a minister. He's an associate pastor, First Presbyterian Church in Berkeley, a big Presbyterian church in Berkeley, California. And what do you think about that picture? It really strikes me. The hands. The man's hands were twice the size of mine. And even in his 80s, he could crush you. I mean, just was a powerful man intellectually, powerful man physically, and just in some ways, kind of an intimidating presence to be around, kind of that kind of person. That was my father, okay? As you know, Robbie and I've done a lot of musical programs. The first one we ever did was Stephen Foster. And anyway, that's Robbie in her hoop skirt, and I got a Kentucky Frock jacket. We went around. People kind of liked, we did that about 70 or 80 times around different places. So then they said people to do another one. So we did Hymns My Mother Taught Me, then we did George Gershwin and Rodgers and Hammerstein and Lerner and Lowe. And we did one on Charles Wesley. So anyway, that's just a picture of us there. It was in the Sentinel, I think. Okay, we took our granddaughter. I organized a trip, University Cadet, there was our sister college, and Querétaro is our sister city. And so Rob and I have been down there about 4 times. I was privileged to take our granddaughter right here. So she was a cheerleader for the University of Querétaro. And then they came back and played, maybe some of you were at the game, they came back and played us some football Americano here at the stadium. So that was a kind of a fun thing to organize. Okay. Retiring from Hope, like I said, I can't imagine being any place other than Hope. I get together every Friday with friends for breakfast. And this is a picture of my close friend, Sheldon Weddick, who many of you know passed away a few years ago. And of course, Jack, and Bob Ritzma. Bob, we've been having breakfast together for years and years and years. We get down to their home now and have breakfast at their house. He's not quite as mobile as he used to be, but I can't imagine. Aren't we fortunate to live here in Holland, Michigan? And this is a place where and this, of course, is the place where I found a home. Just quickly go through some of these others. My brother and I in 2012 took a trip back to Tibet. It was two of my friends organized this trip in 2012, and it was about 27 missionary kids. I hadn't seen half of them since I'd been in China when I was 10 years old. And so it was a thrill to get to meet them again. And we organized this trip. And after the trip was done, my brother and I wanted to get up to Tibet. We had our hearts set on it, but it was iffy. 2012. That was a time when I think when we were going back, a lot of lamas were burning themselves, just setting themselves on fire, and they were a little bit reluctant to have foreigners up in that part of Tibet. But we made it. That's my brother and me I tell you this. This is just almost the same as it was back when my dad loved to get on horseback and go out and tell the story of the gospel of Jesus Christ to the nomads in their tent dwellings. So that's pretty much as it was back in the 1930s. Okay. Don Leiden's put together a little chapter called the Berlin Interlude. I was sent to Germany right away, and Robbie and I were separated. And I said, this does it. I'm not going to have a career where Robbie and I are separated. I just couldn't, for me, it was just more, the love of my life was sort of taken away from me. Right after we got married, I was sent to Germany on temporary duty. So she couldn't come. I happened to be one of the 3 officers in charge of Checkpoint Charlie at the time. And this is Kennedy's. Excuse me, I have a little bit of cold. Kennedy's when he did his famous Ich bin ein Berliner speech, June 26. This is a little porthole. This is looking across it at East Germany or East Berlin. So I spent a lot of my time. The East Germans had a pahooch right about there, and you'd look at traffic coming and going. And there were some stories that I share in the book about some incidents there at the Checkpoint Charlie. Okay. Why this picture? Well, I wanted to have a picture of Hope College, a place where I found a home, and most of us are older here, so we all know Russ DeVette. Wasn't he just a giant of a man? Kind of in some ways my mentor, just a fabulous person. Of course, we all know Ray Smith, and that's a young Jim Boltman. And like Dave Vanderwell said, that was the staff for years and years, the 4 of us. It's changed now, hasn't it? Basically, Ray, of course, was the head coach, and he coached the offensive backs. Russ was the defensive coordinator, and he coached the defensive front. Jim Boltman coached the defensive secondary. I coached the offensive line. Worked out fine. We each had our own area of responsibility, and we knew Ray was in charge, and it worked out great. And I guess I put that in there because I think this is one of the most enjoyable times of my life, working with these 3 men. Jim did a check on it. He said he thought that we probably spent 30 hours a week together just on football. So you get to know people pretty well. And this is Jim and me. I don't even know does anybody know what one of the places we're playing? Jim and I pretending like I know what we're doing up in the crow's nest here, calling down suggestions to Ray Smith and Russ on the sideline. Okay. I think that might wrap it up. Is that the last picture? Okay. Hopefully I haven't just ambled around. Hopefully you get a little bit of a sense of my life. But I do want to open it up for, we've run out of time. Do we have any time for any questions? I don't know.
A question. Okay. Otherwise, would you be willing to stay around a little bit and talk and sell?
I might just say the book is $20. Like I said, all the proceeds go to, nothing goes to me. It all goes back to the Veneralty Institute. And Joanna Smith said $20. It's normally 30. Just, and you can drop 20 if you want to in that orange bag and pick up a copy of the book.
Okay.
Huh? Yeah, I think, you do miss, there are elements in your childhood that you do miss. I've often said my brother lives in Boulder, Colorado. If I could put the Rocky Mountains here and Lake Michigan there, then you'd have the best, the best of both worlds.
Well, thank you so
Yep.
much, George. This is wonderful.